1964, a group of people had the foresight to preserve wild places. For future generations, untrammeled by man, an area primeval, influenced by nature, with outstanding solitude. 50 years later, the world has changed. Will the next generation share the passion? Will we carry the torch? To find out what wilderness means for us, 2 groups of youth went into the wilderness, some of us for the very first time.
Way colder.
Let us know, okay?
I will.
Remember, for every 1,000 feet we go, the temperature drops 10 degrees.
Thought it was 1.
Your tent mates, you guys might be snoring or tossing and turning, and so if there's talking in your sleep, but if there's stuff that's kind of bugging you, just talk it out together.
In your sleep.
In your sleep.
I wish you'd quit doing that. Perfect time. I like it.
So, you're going to get to know each other really, really, really well in 4 days. And, this trip into the wilderness is yours. It doesn't have to be anything other than what it really is for you.
Backcountry horsemen, Forest Service, and outfitters came together to look at ways that we could get youth out into the wilderness. We wanted to give them the opportunity to come out and experience firsthand the important things that wilderness has to offer. Hold that, pull it up tight. Okay, and then slide it down. Yeah. Very good. Do it again.
Because when the horse pulls on this one, you're going to pull it right off. Okay, practice.
Why is stock use important? Well, the Wilderness Act of 1964 provided for 2 ways of transportation into the wilderness, and that was by horseback and by foot. And so our hope is that we can pass on to future generation those traditional ways of traveling, the skills that were used historically, and that they can carry those into the future.
country was wilderness a few hundred years ago, and you know, it has been developed and carved and built upon, roads built, fences. And I'm afraid if there wasn't a Wilderness Act, we would have very little country like this left.
Too.
You know, I feel like you could, but it's kind of more of a marshy lake. But we'll be able to swim it.
Wilderness is important to me because I get to hear the hush of the land while I'm out here. I don't hear planes, trains, or automobiles. I don't hear people screaming. I don't got to deal with babies or dogs or anything. It's wildlife, it's nature, it's the wind and the birds and the insects and the few people that you're out here with.
My name is Natalie Dawson, and I'm director of the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana. I'm also a professor in the College of Forestry and Conservation. I've been running the Wilderness and Civilization program for 3 years now, and so this is my third time participating in our fall trek, which is the first component of a year-long program for students that come from all over the country and sometimes the world to do this program. Wilderness gives us the opportunity to feel like we may be the only ones who have ever been there. We're the only ones that have ever stood on the top of that mountain. We're the only ones that have ever swam in that alpine lake. We're the only ones that have seen that exact view. And it's such a special feeling to have that. And so it's very important when teaching students and bringing them into the wilderness to teach them these ethics, these values such as leave no trace and minimal impact use of an area, so that we leave an area and it's as if we were never there.
I've been on many backpacking trips, and every single time I get out, just in the wild, whether it's the national forest or in a wilderness area, they're all unique and special. And I feel like I learned so much, not just about my surroundings, but also myself. And so I think it's really important for everyone to kind of go through that kind of journey.
Into the creeks.
Cool, so we're probably like halfway. We're halfway.
I'm Steve Kimball, and I'm the program manager for the Northern Region for Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers, and Outfitters and Guides. It's important for young folks to experience wilderness, not just to read about it, not just to see the pictures, because when you come out here, things change for you in a deep level often. When you come out here and see the scenery and experience the solitude, the lack of human influence, you're really visiting the earth how it once was.
The way I get inspired for being out in the wilderness is it just helps me concentrate more, because I don't concentrate very easily, and it just helps me like more like think about the things I want to do, like if I had more time to do it, like what I could do.
And so what we did is we came in and we set up.
I get inspired a lot by around the people out here, and it inspires me to want to come out into the wilderness more.
Any of these kids that come out here, especially if it's their first time, they're going to have some experiences and see some things that they've never seen before. And those will become memories that'll stay with them for their lifetime. And they'll appreciate it, and they will fall in love with this country. They'll want to protect it. They'll want to continue to save it and save places like this. And so we have to introduce this to each generation along the way.
Today was awesome. We got to ride close up to Red Mountain, and it was awesome to stand in the same spot where my grandpa probably stood before.
It was the best time of this whole trip. It was my favorite part. You could see like 100 miles in every direction, all the mountains, all the scenery, the entire wilderness.
Having an experience like that is important to me because it allowed me to sink deeper, I guess I could say, about like everything in my life, family, friends, school, sports, everything.
As soon as we got off the horses, all of us kids kind of just ran up the mountain pretty much. We just kind of took off because personally I wanted to eat lunch on top of a mountain. And we got up there and it's like gorgeous.
Wow.
I've always loved hiking and backpacking, camping, but I've really got into it, I would say, like in high school. It's what I'm most passionate about, being outdoors. It's when I feel most alive. It's just so beautiful, and especially in our world today, which is so full of distractions, technology, and other things. Really, I think a lot of people overlook the beauty of the natural world around them, which is a shame, but that's why, you know, these wilderness areas are here.
Can't believe that we have all of this. I didn't even know this existed. I literally had no idea this existed.
tomorrow's gonna hurt a lot.
Uh-huh. Yes, it will.
Yeah? There's a tree going on my leg. One log to another and just miss my soul.
Okay. So how far in do you think that went? Yeah. Don't bump it if you...
I don't think it's that far, because that didn't hurt quite as bad as I thought it would.
Okay.
Darn it. How deep do you think it is?
Look at the other side.
We were just hanging a bear bag. I was wearing sandals. It was getting a little bit more rugged. I was balancing on a fallen tree, and I jumped to another one, and the tree had lots of little branches sticking out, and the branch I thought would hit my bottom of my sandal, but it just came through or slipped my sandal and hit my flesh. So, feeling all right. I think I'm going to be hiking out tonight because of the risk of infection. So, it's too bad.
I can see the sharp part.
Hurts quite a bit.
Yeah. I think
someone should pull it out.
We're just gonna pull it.
It's gonna hurt.
Did it hurt at first?
Yeah.
If you want to
Son of a... But yeah, that's it. Go slow, and if it seems like it's deeper than we think, just put it back.
Don't put it back. Please don't put it back.
any further.
Yeah. Can somebody go grab us just some soaking water? Yeah. Drinking water, and maybe some sort of a cup.
How do you feel right now on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being
4.
Crazy pain.
3.
Okay.
I feel it'll probably be close to a 7.
Okay, what I want you to do is tell me the scale as it moves, okay?
Okay.
All right.
Ooh, I'm just imagining the pain. It's gonna hurt a lot.
So what I want you to do is stay honest with me on your scale of pain, okay? Yep.
What's it at?
That's probably 6.
Not everything that we do here is going to be, smiles. It's not going to be happy. Sometimes you have to hike farther and harder than you want to. Sometimes your pack is way too heavy. But basically, that's sort of what makes things... That's what makes you so excited about certain little things, like having, say, macaroni for dinner. Like, that just makes you so joyful about that because your day wasn't, perfect, and that's part of it. And that's also what helps you live so simply, is because through that kind of determination and kind of facing that pain, you cut all the haze out, and you learn to sort of feel tired and be hungry and deserve what you have.
I think that kids that spend a little bit of time in the wilderness go away with an increase in self-confidence and self-esteem. When you can go out into the wild and you can be out there for 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week or 2 weeks, if you backpack or ride horses or however you do it, you go away thinking, there's a lot that I didn't know I had the capability of doing. If I can do that, well, then I can probably do a lot of other things I didn't know that I could do. And so, I just think that one of the great things about wilderness is that it does build kids' self-confidence. And of course, that then manifests itself into all sorts of advantages that they'll have now and in the future.
Wilderness means a lot to me because it's like a place where I can go where there's no people and I can just be by myself and alone with my thoughts.
I feel resourceful. I feel like I'm not helpless. There are things I can do and I can do well. If I were out here on my own, I feel like I'd be able to survive.
I feel strong when I'm out here. Like, the fresh air is good, and I love it. I can't really put it into words, I guess. It's a great feeling.
I have more time to myself out here and more time to think rather than I would at home with mom asking me to do this, mom asking me to do that, go here for me, do this. I get inspired because I see a lot of opportunities to do things out in the wilderness. Out here it's just calm and quiet and it's peaceful.
You could just come up to the wilderness and like almost automatically your mind just gets set free. That's something that'll help me. Like someplace I know I can always go to be myself.
So my hope is that everybody that's on this trip and any other trip that they take in the wilderness, that after they leave, that they become some kind of an advocate for the continuing wilderness system. With anything in our system of government, if you don't have support for it, then it's going to change. It's going to disappear. And so we need to have people out in the wilderness to understand the value of wilderness and to become advocates for continuing to maintain the wilderness heritage that we have.
When I'm in the wilderness, what I like most about myself is my ability to be present with where I'm at and to really observe and notice what's going on around me and use all my senses and feel what's happening and my place in the landscape.
As I look into my future, I see wilderness as a place that I can go to for centering, for a place to relax, a place to find new adventures, new views, a different way to view the world, and a place of reflection for me.
One of the most important things about wilderness for me is the solitude and just being out here and being completely alone, but never lonely. That there's so much beauty and wild and life out here that I'm never lonely.
And it's really a positive learning environment. Instead of, sitting in the classroom and reading in a textbook, this fossil came from this time period, or, these trees grow in this environment. You can actually come out and view those things for yourself, feel them, feel the texture, view the colors, and see those interact with each other. And I think that's, for me, the most valuable learning experience that I've had.
I think the Wilderness Act, in the way it reads, slightly like poetry and definitely as a rather impassioned act as far as legal wording is concerned. I think it shows both foresight and aptitude for future generations that we don't really see that much. There are very few laws that we've passed where we've thought about 10, 12, 15 generations down the road. And the Wilderness Act is really and truly one of those only bills that was passed in order to save things for future generations.
Knowing that people 50 years ago worked to save wilderness makes me feel really reassured and like I have company in how I feel about the world and my way of interacting with it. And it's also inspiring in that it gives me energy and hope to go forward and also continue that fight.
I've always felt that it's really been very important for young people to go into the mountains and see and experience wilderness because, we're getting old. And when we get old, we got to pass the baton on to somebody else that's going to carry on with wilderness.
Thinking about what I would say to people who fought for the Wilderness Act is a tough question. I could probably spend countless amount of time thinking about what I'd want to say to them. I mean, the most obvious thing is thank you.
I would have to say to all the people that created Wilderness, just thank you.
I would say the people who fought for the Wilderness Act would a big thank you because if it wasn't for them, I would be sitting.
I know. Oh, hi. Everybody's on. Okay, everybody hears us. All right.
Well, good evening from an icy Dunrovin ranch, and I have, first of all, here in my office, Colby Gerke. Can you say hello, Colby?
Hello, everyone.
And Colby is the program director for the Selway Bitterroot Foundation here in Missoula, Montana. And on the phone from somewhere, Arizona, and I'll have her explain in a moment, is Cindy Swanson. Can you say hello, Cindy?
Hello, and I'm in Southern California now.
Southern California. She's a retired lady on the move, having a great time. And how many dogs do you have with you, Cindy?
We have 4 of our Labrador Retrievers.
That's great. Cindy is a longtime friend of mine who she's recently retired as a project leader for the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which is with the Forest Service. And her area of focus was kind of the human dimensions of resource management. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what you do or did, Cindy?
Yeah, we looked at social and economic issues, so we did a lot of benefit cost analysis, and most of it was related to values associated with public lands, and mostly those values that you really can't quantify with a dollar figure. So things like the value of wilderness, recreation, just living in a community that's surrounded by public lands, trying to find a way to put surrogate dollar values on that so you can compare them to market values and products that come off of public lands.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to gather both of you on a telephone conversation is that a lot of the people who read our book, the Indian Creek Chronicles, which takes place in the Selway, Bitterroot, Frank Church wilderness area, are really unaware of federal land designations and of what we in the West call the Big W, and that is wilderness with a capital W, as opposed to the concept of wilderness. There is an actual federal designation. But before we get onto that, I'd like Colby to say a few more things about what he does and what his organization does.
So, right. I work for the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation. I'm the program director. Our organization started in 2005 as a nonprofit partner of the United States Forest Service. Back in the early 2000s, the U.S. Forest Service identified a growing need in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness for general trail maintenance, campsite restoration, wilderness character monitoring is one thing that we do that's not very well known. And they realized that with their declining budgets, they would not be able to continue to steward the land in the way that they hoped to do so, that Congress had designated them to do so. So they formed a friends group, a partner group called the Selway Bitterroot Foundation. And we've operated for the last 11 years as a direct partner of the U.S. Forest Service doing boots-on-the-ground stewardship. So boots on the ground means we're out there getting dirty. We're out there cutting the trees out of the trails, making sure that the water drains off the trail, and that you can get to your favorite campsite and enjoy the solitude of the wilderness.
All right. So I would like to start, Cindy, with you. And if you wouldn't mind giving us a brief thumbnail history of what Big W is. What is wilderness, and who's involved in designating an area wilderness, and what are the implications for the Forest Service when they have a piece of wilderness under their management?
Okay, I might take a step back, and it might have been covered in the video, and I apologize. It's still loading here. It's been loading for a half hour. But I will recommend, if you have a real interest in wilderness, probably the best site to go to is wilderness.net. And that's a website that is shared by all the federal employees and the University of Montana, and it has everything you'd ever want to ask or know about wilderness with maps and publications. So it's a wonderful resource. And in 1964, when they passed the Wilderness Act, it was a way to designate areas, and the two words that always come to mind when talking about Big W is untrammeled, like the movie you saw, which is man's imprint is unnoticeable, so a place you can go and not see what man has done to other areas. And then the other one is that sense of solitude. So man is just a visitor who does not remain. And in general, to designate something as a wilderness area, it's in theory supposed to be greater than 5,000 acres. And it goes through a wilderness study area that is watched and managed by the different agencies to see if it has those characteristics, which is the wilderness character monitoring we do, to see if it's got the characteristics that give it the untrammeled nature and the solitude quality that we're looking for.
And Cindy, when was the Wilderness Act? When did Congress recognize the importance of areas like this and actually create a federal designation?
Well, the Act passed in 1964, and they went through a process which many of you probably heard about was the Rare 2 inventory process, where they were looking at areas to designate as wilderness and build that wilderness system. So it was a very methodical way to go and look at land areas, plus or minus 5,000 acres, to see if they carried the characteristics that they were looking for in wilderness.
And it takes some congressional action, does it not, Cindy, for an area that designation?
Yes, to be a federal wilderness area, it has to have congressional approval. And sometimes the president can, do one of their magic things and designate areas.
Yeah. Well, in the book that we've all just read, Indian Creek Chronicles, of course, this takes place in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area. And it's clear that the wilderness characteristic is a really important character in the book, that Pete's coming of age, if you will, happens in part because of that sense of solitude. And I would like to hear from both of you about that. First of all, maybe I'd like to hear from Colby about what it means on a personal level, since you spend a lot of time in that very area where Pete was. And then, Cindy, if you would follow up with some of the research that you've done in terms of its social significance to others.
Okay. Well, the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness Area is the third largest federally designated wilderness in the U.S. Forest Service system in the continental United States. It's about 1.3 million acres of wild country surrounded by countless acres of non-designated wild country. It's a tremendously vast place, and it varies very much from the Bitterroot Crest here on the Montana-Idaho border, right near where we are today, to a very, dry and low terrain near the Selway River as it exits the wilderness area near Fenn Ranger Station to the west of here. My experience back there has been working with volunteers, working with trail crew members, and spending time on my own backpacking and living and working in this vast ecosystem. It's very rugged, very remote terrain, and travel there can be very challenging. A lot of the trails that are marked on the map are no longer maintained and no longer easy to follow or find. There is so much up and down and traversing across slopes. It's a very exhausting place to travel, and you can just really go for weeks at a time without leaving the wilderness if you so chose. And it's that sense of solitude that comes with a place of that size, and the humble feeling that you have as you set foot into that place and know that, a rescue is so far away that you must take care of yourself, and your own self-reliance is a really powerful feeling. And I think that a place of the size and scale of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness really elicits those emotions very well.
And this is why you chose your particular field of work, is it not, Colby, that you enjoy that? That's an important part of your life, to have that.
It is. I'm a native Montanan and have a real passion for the mountains and a real desire to spend my life near these type of places. And I think it offers me a contrast to the day-to-day busyness of life, and a totally different way of living that is brings calm and sanity and peace to my life when, it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, and to know and to be able to travel to a place as wild and truly special as this is a wonderful contrast that I'm lucky as a Montanan to have.
Cindy, how does his feelings reflect in the research? I mean, you've done your group has done a lot of work on the economic and social values of wilderness. And are these the kind of sentiments that you have been able to measure?
To a certain extent, yeah, and I think it really pulls back to some of that wilderness character. And in the social science research, there's been a lot of focus on, well, what does solitude mean? It's a huge thing in the Wilderness Act, but what does solitude, when do you know you've hit it? And for a lot of people, and I'd say Colby is one of them, is when you can go days without seeing any reflection of a human imprint or anything on the land, not see other people, not see airplanes flying overhead. And so that's one definition of solitude. But they're finding more and more in research that people really want to share that experience, whether it's hiking in with one other person or passing someone on the trail occasionally and sort of sharing that feeling of being in a wild place, or even having watching the Discovery Channel and being able to see those wide open places and get your own sense of solitude from just that experience of watching it on TV, because a lot of people will never have a true, big W wilderness experience when they're out there and truly on their own with no access to cell phones. So there's a huge range that they're finding within the social science of how tolerant people are of seeing other people and encountering those people when they have a wilderness experience, and really finding that for many people, sharing that experience still feels like solitude, because you want to share those things that you love and those views you see with other people. And that's how we derive some of that satisfaction, is in that sharing. So a wide range of, and so can you have a wide range of wilderness areas that provide those different senses of solitude and sharing that people are looking for?
Interesting. One of the things that Pete talked about in his book was his reaction to people who had an easy time getting in. I'd ask Colby to address it for just a moment. That road that's right into Magruder, and it went by Indian Creek, and that's an anomaly, is it not? And that's a kind of a special situation.
Yeah, so the road that Indian Creek is on, that's the Paradise Road, and it's a stem road off of the Magruder Corridor. The Magruder Corridor is a very long, rough gravel road that connects a remote part of Montana to an even more remote part of Idaho. It's sometimes called the Darby to Elk City Road. So if you look up Darby on a map of Montana and Elk City of Idaho, that's the general corridor that it follows. One of the unique things about the Magruder Corridor, other than its history, which is fascinating, but we're not going to get into that tonight, it's about a 60-foot wide road designation. And on either side of that road are federally designated wilderness areas. There's the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness to the north, and to the south is the Frank Church Wilderness. And the road that Indian Creek sits on, the Paradise stem of that, ends at the boat launch for the wild and scenic river, the Selway River, and one of the most difficult but amazing float trips you'll ever do, the Selway River. Indian Creek is it's a cherry stem road into the wilderness, and that's meant to say that it's just a thin ribbon of non-wilderness that provides access to a very remote area. So Pete was literally surrounded by wilderness, but where his camp was and where his truck were, those weren't actually wilderness, which is why he was able to use a chainsaw to gather firewood, which is why he was able to drive a truck in there, which is why they were able to bring in snow machines in the middle of winter. One of the major tenets of the Wilderness Act was no mechanized or mechanical machinery is allowed. So anything that has a wheel, as simple as a wheelbarrow or a game cart, you can't use in the wilderness. It all has to be what are known as primitive tools. And now there's going to be exceptions to that. Every wilderness area has administrative exceptions or grandfathered in clauses. Private inholdings like ranches are an example of this. But the purpose of these wilderness areas is, life is supposed to be hard. You are living in a much more primitive area, and man is meant to be impeded. It's meant as a sanctuary from humans and from our toiling and manipulating. So we put the Act specifically put into place provisions that would impede human advancement in these areas. And Pete was right on the very edge of this vast wilderness, and therefore was able to bring in his truck and use a chainsaw to cut all that firewood, which I'm sure he really appreciated.
Yeah, I'm sure he did too. But if you talk about the social aspect that Cindy just mentioned in the research and sharing these values together, really being consistent with the Wilderness Act, the only ways in which people can enjoy them together is either on foot or on horseback. Is that not correct? Or canoe? Or
there are, the primary means of travel through the Selway Better Route are on foot or on horse or on a raft. Rafting is popular on the Selway River. It's a difficult permit to land, and therefore there's a very limited amount of boat launches allowed each day. That said, there are 3 backcountry airstrips in the wilderness area, and those are on private ground or on administered land that the Forest Service has, and they're used for the transport of goods and people in and out of the wilderness. So there are some airstrips, but they're very small and not that impactful.
So, Cindy, elaborate a little bit on your research findings and what do you think are the implications for how wilderness is managed. So, for example, for these, for people to have an opportunity to socialize and to experience this in a group setting.
Well, I think the general feeling is there are many areas that are maybe more appropriate, campgrounds that are not the more modern campgrounds. There are areas where people can gather and socialize as groups that, might feel like wilderness, but aren't designated wilderness. But you can go in with a group. Some areas you have to have a special permit depending upon the group size and the purpose of the group. But some of the provisions within the Wilderness Act allow for group activities if it has a recreational educational purpose. So you're allowed to go in there together, and then some of these areas for administrative use, of course, get closed. But the true intent of the Wilderness Act is to experience nature that does not have human effects on it. So it's a very specific use of public lands, and with all the other types of public lands, you wouldn't expect to be able to go in on, four-wheel drive, because then you wouldn't be meeting the intent of the Wilderness Act. And I think once people understand the various designations of different public lands, it becomes pretty clear what the purpose of wilderness is for an experience of solitude and that untrammeled nature.
In just talking about this, it would sound like a, pretty uncontroversial kind of a thing to have a wilderness area. Sounds good. But I know that it's not. It's not without a lot of controversy here in the West. Would you touch on that, Cindy? What has the controversy stemmed from? I mean, here, those of us who live in the West understand that there are people who live around wilderness that both embrace them and reject them. And the Forest Service gets caught in the middle.
Yeah, I think there's 2 really good examples, and one of them is the provision. One of the special provisions was some of these dams that had been built to allow irrigation water for ranchers and farmers. A lot of those reservoirs that were created are in wilderness areas, and those dams are starting to breach and break down. And so the controversy is, yeah, you can go in and fix those dams, and there's several in the Bitterroot. You can go in and fix it, but you can't use mechanized tools to go in and fix those dams. Well, that puts the agriculture and rancher in a very precarious situation, because that's hard to do, to bring all the tools you need in on horseback or mule and do all the work without power tools, chainsaws to fix those dams. And some of them are, 100 years old, so they're really in a poor state. And if they breach or completely break down, the potential of flooding homes and small communities is pretty high. And so where is that line of, boy, we really need to respect those reservoirs because they were provisions brought in with the Wilderness Act to allow for irrigation, but they're breaking down, and should there be an exception and allow people to go in with chainsaws and power tools to fix those dams? So that's one of them where there's that conflict, and what is the right answer, and that depends upon who you talk to. And then another one that is this commercial use. You're not allowed to profit or say no commercial use of wilderness areas. Well, a lot of companies want to come in and do movies and videos to share the wilderness with the general public that may never seen those areas. But if you're going to commercially benefit from it, then you can't go in there. So then you're in that fine line of, is this purely for educational purposes, or is there a commercial benefit from going in and doing video and filming in the wilderness? So those are two probably big ones that you can see. You could argue either side of those, I think, pretty effectively on what's the right thing.
Yeah, and Cindy, I would add that, there's been, even in the 1960s when the act was passed, there was, some opposition to wilderness designations. And, one of the terms that gets thrown around a lot around here is, it's the land of no use. And that idea is that, we're tying up massive chunks of land in really difficult federal designations that prohibit things like logging or mining or any commercial development. And, some of the industry of the West was founded on those very things. So there's been some natural opposition in that way. I think, the wilderness movement in the United States, it needs to cultivate allies and work with its allies. Interestingly enough, one of the most recent wilderness designations that just occurred in Idaho last year, the Boulder White Cloud designation, was very strongly opposed to that wilderness designation by a community and a group that is typically a major ally of the wilderness community, and that's the mountain biking community that has sprung up around the Boulder White Cloud. Typically, the mountain biking community is a non-motorized recreation group that very much supports wilderness designation and very much supports public land protection. When the Boulder White Clouds was designated as federal wilderness, their specific use, mountain biking, became prohibited overnight. And that led to a lot of opposition and a lot of unhappiness amongst the big community that typically supports wilderness designation. So the wilderness movement in general needs to be cautious and cultivate allies as opposed to creating new adversaries.
Now, one of the questions we have from the viewers is the overlap between wilderness preservation and, say, conservation of birds. And when you could extend that to conservation of ecosystem services. So kind of talk about that as well. You've got these big land areas. How does that impact the wildlife resources, the bird resources, the sort of the wilderness designation and their management, for example?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that every state is mandated to manage their own wildlife and fish. So while the wilderness is a federal land designation, the state, so in this case Montana and Idaho respectively, are on their own to develop their own wildlife management plan.
Mm-hmm.
And now those state agencies cannot just come in and say, we need to manage western cutthroat trout in the Bitterroot, and so we're going to drive ATVs up to every dam and improve them. Nor can the Idaho Fish and Game come in and, fly in helicopters everywhere they want to go in the wilderness in order to track and tag elk. So those state-run wildlife managers are beholden to the same regulations when working in wilderness areas as users are when they try to travel in wilderness, or federal government agencies when they go to do things like maintain trails or improve campsites. So,
wilderness can be part of an important part of habitat preservation, though, for specific species, can it not?
Well, and I think that's been a major push to designate more wilderness. Is in the Northern Rockies, we have what are seen as 3 large intact ecosystems, and that's the Glacier National Park Bob Marshall Complex, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church ecosystem. And, for some key species, such as mesocarnivores like wolverines, lynx, pine martens, they rely on having very large tracts of land for habitat. They require big spaces for themselves. And so having a large intact ecosystem, I think, expands the type of species that you can actually conserve and hope to give them a fighting chance.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on that, Cindy?
Yeah, I would add that it gives you a wonderful chance to get kind of a baseline of what the needs for that species are by seeing it in a larger, more intact ecosystem, so that you can have a sense of which management activities might have a greater impact on them outside of that wilderness boundary.
Yeah, and I would like to ask both of you, maybe in closing, about the future of wilderness given climate change. And when you talk about untrammeled and unimpacted by man's management, as the climate changes, the nature of those wilderness areas are going to change with it. And how does the Forest Service and how are managers viewing wilderness as a part of our understanding climate change, and what are we going to, what, if anything, are agencies going to do to manage in the face of climate change? Has that been a topic, Cindy, in the Forest Service?
Particularly related to the range of natural variation and the impact of fire. As climate change makes some areas drier and hotter, should we go in and do some active management in a wilderness because you're going to have a hotter, more intense fire than you would expect under the natural system? So when is it appropriate maybe to go in and do some active management so the impact of climate change and fire or weeds isn't going to be as large an impact, and maybe take that wilderness area longer to recover from a natural event?
I really think that my personal view, and I'm taking off my Selway Bitterroot cap here, is that wilderness areas offer us a very unique opportunity as a control variable in the great experiment that is climate change. We know that places are going to get hotter and drier. We know that some places are going to get wetter and cooler. What's going to happen to the subalpine and montane forests that dominate the landscape around here? We have a lot of places that are non-designated wilderness where we certainly can and will manipulate certain variables in the ecosystem to see which plants and which flora and fauna can and will thrive under changing circumstances. What we don't have a lot of is large, intact, natural ecosystem. And I think that's something that wilderness does provide. There's already a lot of look at wilderness areas of what is climate change doing already. In Colorado, Regis University is watching several of the 14,000-foot peaks at the timberline, and what they're seeing is more and more encroachment of subalpine species into the true alpine zone. There's large meadows in the Frank Church of Idaho, as it's gotten hotter and drier in the past decade, that now we're starting to see conifers growing in those meadows that typically were too wet in order to support conifers in the past. And a big question, I think, as a society and as recreational users of wilderness that we have to ask ourselves and answer is, how much change are we willing to tolerate? I think that the change is going to happen, and we need to bear in mind that this is a natural process and that we need to allow nature to make adaptations to changes that are coming. I don't think that wilderness is the place to poke and prod and particularly manipulate in order to maintain what we're used to seeing in a particular ecosystem. I think as climate changes, ecosystems will change, and we need to allow nature to make those adaptations, because ultimately I think that will result in greater resiliency as opposed to man-made manipulations and alterations.
There's going to be pressure in all directions, isn't there? I mean, a lot of people are going to want to retain those ecosystems that they are accustomed to, and yet the climate is changing and the conditions are changing and the ecosystem will change with it. Well, Cindy, I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your retirement in California, and Colby, I really want to thank you for coming. This was really interesting for me, and I know it was for our viewers as well. And our next book for everybody listening is Fool's Crow, which we will be talking with the wife of the author. The author is dead, but his wife is living. She's 80 years old, and she will be meeting with us on February 20th. And I look forward to talking with you all then. And with that, I'll say good night and sign off. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye, Cindy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. You can pull the plug, Mackenzie. Thank you.